Good morning. Today's Monday, May the 1st. This is Focus on the News. I'm Senator Dick Black, retired senator of Virginia. Had a very nice event over the weekend. Went and spoke at the Virginia War Memorial for the anniversary of the fall of Saigon, which was a very painful event for our Vietnamese American community. And, it shows what the media does, how immensely they can distort things, because as we fought the war in Vietnam, the media began to promote this narrative that somehow if the South Vietnamese government fell, that it would be replaced and there would be a people's paradise. And very communistic notion, and this was sort of the idea. And of course, it did not happen. And as the Americans fled the embassy, or evacuated, shouldn't say fled, as we evacuated our embassy, there were mothers who came and lined up by the exit path for the Americans, and they literally thrust their infant babies into the arms of complete strangers, not knowing whether these were good people, bad people, knowing that they would never, ever, as long as they lived, see those children again. But knowing that their entire families would be slaughtered, and hoping that somehow the blood of that family would survive on somewhere, somehow. Anyway, amazing how many of the people there, the Vietnamese Americans, would tell me that their fathers, their mothers, mostly fathers, but their fathers, their grandfathers, would have spent 8 years, 10 years, 17 years in prison, in not in just a prison, but in a concentration camp. And so it was very interesting. Vietnamese Americans are just wonderful citizens of this great country that we have. And they understand what communism means and the horrors of it. And they certainly experienced it, many of them, after the fall of Saigon, when the North Vietnamese took over and imposed this horrific state of communism on South Vietnam. But anyway, well, let me get started here. I want to touch just for a minute on Tucker Carlson. I think everybody knows by now Tucker Carlson was fired by Fox News. Nobody quite knows why, because he was certainly their biggest draw. Which, for many people, he was the reason that people watched. The only real show other than Tucker Carlson, the only thing I watched on Fox News was I would watch the Financial News Network. Now, it frustrates me a lot to watch the financial news on Fox News, because usually the lead off in the morning is you get this big diatribe about how we need to go to war against this one and that one and the other one, and everybody's somehow this global threat to us, and so it's sort of a big war promotion at the beginning, and then you go into a nice presentation on financial matters. And while I'm not a fan of MSNBC, but their financial program tends to be less political than Fox News is. It tends to deal with money. And the layout is perhaps not as smooth as on Fox News, but the information is there, and it actually has a longer duration to where you can tune in for longer. So I don't know how much I'll watch Fox News in the future, because now it's interesting that when Tucker Carlson left, Fox News, the whole network, lost 56% of its viewership. Just a phenomenal drop. It's like you stepped off the top of the Empire State Building, and all of a sudden you're lunging towards the sidewalk. And the problem for Fox News is not only did they lose Tucker Carlson, but he's kind of the lead off, kind of the spur for shows like Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham. I don't watch Sean Hannity. He's a little bit too much of sort of beating the war drums and so forth. Laura, she's pretty good, I think. But anyway, what's happened for these other people is that, to some extent, through no fault of their own, they have suffered massive declines because people would tune in to watch Tucker Carlson, and then they'd say, okay, well, let's see what else is on here, and they'd watch more of the show. So the question, of course, everybody is speculating, and so you'll just hear speculation from me. The question, though, is why did Fox News fire its biggest star? It certainly wasn't that they weren't making money on him. I think he got $20 million a year from what I heard. But Fox News certainly made many multiples times that. So they were making tons of money on him. But I think there were a couple of things. One is that Tucker Carlson disputed the logic of the war in Ukraine. He was very skeptical of the war in Ukraine, and he would discuss the reality of what was going on there. That is a no-no with the global corporate media. These guys are all interlinked. Don't make a mistake and think, well, CNN is this, Fox News is that. There are certain areas where they each have sort of mapped out the area that they will deal with culturally, especially. But when it comes to things like war and that sort of thing, they're all very closely linked, I think, in a very unhealthy way. So I think he had really caused some waves by questioning the war in Ukraine, and to some extent this proliferation of wars everywhere that's gone on ever since George Bush started it, and then Barack Obama, put it on speed with becoming one of the bloodiest regimes in American history. And so anyway, I think the wars were a big part of it. The other thing, and this is very serious, there's been a concerted effort, in my opinion, to silence voices of opposition before we get into the 2024 presidential election cycle. You can see what happened to One American News, which was a rapidly growing, very popular program, very professionally presented. And they were deplatformed because they discussed the election fraud. That's one of those forbidden topics. Just like the COVID was a forbidden topic. It's some of that has broken down, but some of it remains. But also the biggest no-no is if you question the wars, if you point out the fact that the war in Syria wasn't started by some goofy rebels out in the hinterlands, but was started by the Central Intelligence Agency, and that they were providing weapons to Al-Qaeda through program Timber Sycamore, where they had warehouses across the border in Turkey, and they funneled all of these weapons in. They didn't give them directly to Al-Qaeda, but they gave them to Al-Qaeda affiliates that then gave them to Al-Qaeda. So it was a little bit of a card shuffle. But in any event, I think that I think you see this deplatforming of voices willing to question the legitimacy of the elections, the legitimacy of the war state, the legitimacy of the COVID hysteria. And in any event, I think we're seeing dissenting voices silence. I don't think it's an accident. Okay. Let me get into this morning's issues. The prime topic today is that America is being swept by crime, fear, and violence. I've picked up an article here from last week, but there was a lot of publicity that last week on Saturday, there were hundreds of teenagers who were flooding into downtown Chicago, smashing car windows, forcing a major police response. What they were doing, literally just going, it's, by the way, if you've ever had to break into a car window, you're going to realize, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It isn't easy to break a car window. Car windows are, they're very tough. They're not like the old windows of the 1920s. They're designed with a plastic filler between the layers of glass. And so when you smash a car window, you have applied an enormous amount of power with something hard. You know, you're using hammers and that kind of thing. But in any event, you had these hundreds of rampaging kids smashing car windows. At least one person in a car was attacked. And it was interesting that there were shots being fired, and Fox 32, a Chicago TV program, finally, in the midst of their programming, they announced that they were withdrawing because they felt it was unsafe to keep their news crew on the scene. So that makes it a little difficult for the news to say, oh, this is a mostly peaceful riot, because not everyone was shot during the riot. That's sort of the way you would hear it during the Trump administration, where you had all of these corrupt, decadent old generals, Colin Powell and people like that, who said, "Oh yes, the burning of buildings in Washington D.C. and across the nation. This is mostly peaceful. Yeah, give me a break." But in any event, they had two teens who were wounded in the crowds, and they reported that a woman whose car was smashed by people who were jumping on the windshield said that they reached in and they beat up her husband while he was just sitting in the driver's seat, wasn't doing anything, wasn't hurting anybody, but he was just somebody convenient to beat, and so they did. Now, it's really instructive that the Democrats have chosen Chicago, which is where this rampage was occurred, and they chose that to be the place where they want to put on their national convention in 2024. It's no accident. Chicago exemplifies the failed Democrat political leadership and the values of the party. Violence is a value of the Democrat Party, particularly racially oriented violence. The place, Chicago, I went there, oh my gosh, years and years ago, and ended up driving through the wrong part of town, and it is an eerie place. You go literally for miles, and you have high-rise buildings on either side that are just vacant, abandoned. I mean, it is one spooky, spooky city. And it just shows what happens when you get into this whirlpool of racial hatred and so forth that just sort of sucks the whole community down and destroys it. But you look at what's happened. They just announced that Walmart shutting down stores in Chicago, and it was 5 years ago. Target pulled out, closed down their stores. What are the good, decent people in these inner city neighborhoods? What do they do? These politicians never care about the good people. They care about the violent mobs and what can they do for the violent mobs. But there are good people in these communities that they need to be served. They deserve law and order. But in any event, Walmart has lost so much money from the uncontrolled crime and stealing that they're pulling out. You can imagine lots of smaller stores are doing the same thing because they can't make money. They don't want to be there. And besides, it's threatening. I mean, who wants to work in a place where people are mostly peaceful, but sometimes they come in and just beat the hell out of you? So Chicago it's become a dystopian cesspool of racism and crime, and it's a great shame. Part of it stems from this fact that now for at least a generation, we have had this critical race theory infiltrated into our public school system, so that nationwide you have minority youth being taught that they're oppressed and that these other kids are oppressors. And for that reason, you're entitled to lash out and to punish innocent people solely because of their race. I don't think I grew up under segregation. I worked to end it as just a young teenage boy because I felt it was very unfair. But I don't recall any attempt by people to indoctrinate a sense of hatred towards the other race, which for the most part was blacks back at that time. There were some Hispanics, but people didn't back then. They weren't sliced and diced into different things. Somebody who was from Latin America was, they're just people. But now we've categorized so that we can create tensions as much as possible. That stems principally from Democrat politics. But we've got this situation where, we now have created a culture that is devoid of any religious anchor. And now we have reduced any effective police presence in some of these areas. And at the same time, we're teaching kids, hey, you're oppressed. You've got a right to go out and steal, burn, destroy, beat people up. And one of the things we most need in this country is we need a different breed of minority leaders, ones who can, through their own personal example and words and deeds, say, look, good behavior is essential to economic success. It is essential to cultural success. You cannot be successful. You can't expect your home values to be high and to get a high assessment if right down the road you got a business section that's been burned out and you got homeless people drifting around. You got graffiti all over the place. Just isn't going to happen. So we need people who can somehow convey that message that our minority communities are being taken advantage of very badly by people who know that if they can generate enough hatred and enough violence, then they can persuade the people in these communities to vote their way and keep them in power and keep them at the levers of the money spigot. So we've got this problem, and it's if you look at all of the Democrat-run cities, they undercut their police. They glorify criminals like Michael Brown and George Floyd. Think about it. Michael Brown, who has been lionized by the media. This is a guy who literally 30 minutes before he died had committed a strong-arm robbery in a minority neighborhood, in a minority store, pushing around and manhandling the clerk in the place. And then he goes and he's walking down the center of the street, blocking traffic, and a police officer called over to him. And he says, "Sir," he says, you're going to have to get out of the road." And Michael Brown, who's a huge dude, he comes roaring up to the police car, and he lunges inside. Here you got a police trooper who's just sitting there telling him you can't block the road, and he lunges in. He tries to grab the pistol to kill the officer, and fortunately the officer's pretty big fellow too, and they struggle, and Michael Brown couldn't get the pistol, so Brown starts stalking off, and at that point, obviously, you got an extremely dangerous individual wandering the street. Police officer gets by the door of his car, steps out, and aims his pistol, and he ordered Brown to stop, and Brown comes back to come after him, and at that point, he pulls the trigger and he drops Brown. This is a guy the media is making this guy out as a hero, a guy who has literally just tried to kill the officer who ultimately shot and killed him. And before that, he had committed a strong-arm robbery. And then look at George Floyd. George Floyd never had any socially redeeming value from the day he was born. He was a career criminal. He had been incarcerated multiple times for just an array of criminal offenses. And it wasn't that long before he died that he had been released from spending years in prison, 5 years in prison, for leading a gang that did a home invasion robbery of a single pregnant woman. And Michael Brown went in disguised as a city worker, and then once he was in, he ushered in all of his thugs, and they rampaged through the house. They pistol whipped this. Here's a woman about to be a mother. They pistol whipped her. She's probably bleeding all over the place. And Michael Brown, our great Michael Brown, or I'm sorry, George. Now I'm back to Michael Brown. But George Floyd takes a loaded pistol, holds it to the belly of this very pregnant woman, and he threatens to pull the trigger and blow the guts out of her unborn baby. And so this is the guy who is now the hero. And how did he die? Well, the media like to say, well, somebody put his knee on his neck. Well, the police officer did apply a neck hold that was clearly, unambiguously authorized by the police department. And but what killed George Floyd is he had taken a massive overdose of fentanyl. Fentanyl is 80 to 100 times as effective as heroin, and it acts by paralyzing your diaphragm, which means you can't breathe. And so before he was ever wrestled to the ground, before anybody had ever really manhandled him, he was just walking over to a police car. And the video that the attorneys, the prosecutors concealed, which they should not have concealed, showed that as he was walking along, he said, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And he could not breathe because he had overdosed on fentanyl, as well as morphine, as well as amphetamines. His body was like a toxic dump, a waste dump. And so he died of an overdose of fentanyl. And now we got a police officer in prison for 20 years because George Floyd killed himself on drugs. And so we've got all of this stuff. We've got in Democrat cities, they turn the criminals loose. And of course, they're murderers, they're robbers, they're looters, they're rapers. And what do they do when they're released? They kill, they rape, they rob, they loot. Democrats are encouraging drug use. You can see that. I mean, this has been going on now for 10 years. Is let's legalize marijuana. Marijuana is wonderful, and all of these innocent people are in jail for marijuana. I was talking with a DEA agent just yesterday, very, very fine woman, and talking with her husband at the same time. And I said, I'm really against what we're doing with marijuana. And it was almost like, oh my gosh, somebody gets it. Somebody understands what's going on. I can tell you as a former career prosecutor that those people who are in prison because they just sold marijuana, typically, I mean, I'll tell you 98% of the time, what happens is you have somebody, they committed a murder, they did 3 rapes, they carried out an armed robbery in a store, and then they got caught with 50 pounds of marijuana. They get into a back and forth, and some of the cases are maybe difficult to prove. Maybe some of the witnesses are afraid to testify because they'll be assassinated. And the next thing, the prosecutor works a deal. Okay, we'll cap your punishment at 5 years for distribution of marijuana. Okay, got a deal. So they go to prison. Well, what does the record show? It shows that they were convicted of a marijuana offense. Doesn't show that the prosecutor knew they had committed murder, knew that they had committed rape, knew that they had committed robbery, but that it was very difficult to prove that. And things are moving fast in the world of prosecution. You only have so much time. And so anyway, so we've got this new wave of drugs are wonderful. We're making lots of money on selling drugs, and first it's marijuana, which is causing all kinds of social problems already. Next it'll be, well, cocaine ain't so bad. Let's do that. Yeah, heroin. Hey, heroin's is only an 80th as bad as fentanyl. So why not just let people have a little heroin? We'll have heroin stores. Maybe the marijuana stores can deal in cocaine and heroin too. It's a mess culturally. You look at what else, and particularly bad in the Democrat states, but even in the Republican states, our public schools now, they're steeped in racist, critical race theory, which teach people to hate one another, and transgenderism, which indoctrinates children in this freakish belief that boys are girls and girls are boys. Almost something that if I had told people 10 years ago that today we would be telling young girls to slash off your breast and become a boy. They just said, you're somebody who needs to be in an asylum. But here we are. I mean, we're very, very seriously in this situation today. But we've got this problem that we teach children to just have disdain for religion, for Christianity particularly, that this is old-fashioned stuff. It's silly stuff. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. Forget it. What are you old-fashioned? And now, we're teaching generations of kids to go around with a chip on their shoulder, microaggression. I'm going to tell you what, I wish some of these people who talk about microaggressions could have gone through Parris Island boot camp back when I did. And, a microaggression on Parris Island is when the drill instructor came beating the metal trash can at 5 a.m. in the morning, saying, "Get up, get up, get up." And all of a sudden, you're on the top bunk, and the next thing, if it took you 3 seconds to leap out of that bunk, they threw you. You fell. You went crash into the floor, and the next thing, you're jumping up, and somebody's punching you in the belly. I wish that these ninnies who teach in the universities today, I wish they could experience some real aggression and get over this stupid thing, a microaggression. Well, somebody didn't smile at me when they walked by, or some white woman, some Karen, she walked to the other side of the street just because there were a group of five inner city kids walking with their pants down behind their butt. I mean, give me a break. That is a microaggression, and you're teaching people to hate other people because of microaggression. I'm saying normal people experience microaggressions every day of their entire life because that's human interaction. Not everybody likes you. Not everybody likes me. Some people think, I don't like that fellow. Other people say, I really like that guy. That's life. That's culture. So in any event, we've got our problem. Now here's somebody who's got a fix. It's not the one that I would encourage. I see we've got big politic that has signed on here, and says the Commonwealth of each state needs to be held accountable. Well, all of the political elites need to be held accountable. That's for sure. Now, here's an interesting thing. The people in high crime cities are now having their cars bulletproofed. There's a company called Armor Max, and I guess for some years they have made bulletproof cars. And but now they say about 18 months ago, there's just been a really shocking increase of people who are relying on the on bulletproofing to have some level of personal protection. And they say that particularly in areas like Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Memphis, Atlanta, New Orleans, Chicago, they're having repeat business. It's very expensive, by the way, to bulletproof your car. I've driven in bulletproof cars, and depending if you have the serious treatment, the cars are extremely expensive, and they're kind of costly to maintain as well as to bulletproof. I'm sure they've got lower levels of protection that they do also. But in any event, here's comments by a couple of the customers of Armor Max. One of them says, I think that post-COVID, things have changed. He says, big city crime, road rage, shootings, carjackings. I drive my car down to the Strip every day. There's been a lot of incidents here. I feel safer. It was well worth it, and I'd do it again. This is one of the customers who's had his car bulletproofed. Here's another client from Los Angeles, a woman, and she says she's going to be picking up her newly armored SUV from the Utah plant in June. And here's a quote from her. I have kids. No one gets punished for anything anymore, so these incidents are only going to increase. That seems pretty obvious. So I think it's just the sensible thing to do. Well, I'll tell you, I remember my father when I was just a boy. He was an Internal Revenue agent. He was responsible for Latin America. And I remember him coming back from somewhere. It may have been in Mexico. It may have been down in South America even. But he came back and he told us that in the city where he was, he said people have bars on their windows. We found that shocking. We really found it shocking. It was the idea that a culture could be so primitive that people were unsafe without having bars on their windows just was incomprehensible. Well, that's a long time ago. I mean, this was a time when even in a good-sized city, people sometimes left their doors open at night. It wasn't that there wasn't crime. There were burglaries in Miami when I was growing up, but there weren't the murders, there weren't the rapes and this kind of thing, and people just didn't get accosted on the streets. That just didn't happen. So I'll never forget that. Bars on the windows. What a shock that was. Today, my sister lives in Miami. She has bars on her windows, and I'm thankful she does. So we've got a situation where government is not doing its job. It is trying to do things that hurt the people rather than help the people. It's a shame, and I hope we get over it. And I think maybe working together, you and I can change the world a little bit and get us moving in a better direction. But in any event, that's the show for today. I look forward to having you back with us on Wednesday.